Last time we looked together at the Book of Esther, you may remember the King Ahasuerus, giving Mordecai the Jew his signet ring, and that signet ring carried with it the entire legal power of the Persian Empire. And so Mordecai had the power to do anything and to issue a new law, and the object of that was to, in some way, cancel out the edict that Haman had issued some time ago. And of course, Haman's edict was that the people of the empire should kill all the Jews in the empire. And that would have been a terrible action, because at that time 44% of the population of the empire were thought to have been Jews. So the idea of Haman was to kill nearly half of the population of the empire. And he really meant that. He hated the Jews so much. But of course, Haman was dead. And now the king gives the power to make new laws to Mordecai, the Jew. And Mordecai could therefore make a law to prevent the effects of Haman's edict taking place. But there was a problem, and we looked at that last time, and we found that Mordecai actually had no option but to choose the same date as the date when Haman's edict was going to be put into force. And I won't repeat that argument, except to say that if he did it before the edict of Haman took place, then he would have prevented that act of murderous intent taking place. But you see, the law of the land was what's called the law of the Medes and the Persians, which once it was put into law, once it had been sealed with the king's signet ring, could not be altered. So you could not, it was impossible to change any law that had been issued. It had to be fulfilled. And even though Haman was dead, and even though the king wanted to cancel that happening, that Haman's edict, he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it without undermining the whole basis of law for the Persian Empire. But the king had a different idea. He now gave Mordecai, the Jew, the same powers as Haman had had. He gave him the signet ring and said, you now make a law which, if possible, will frustrate the purposes of Haman. And we're going to look at this passage under three headings. First, the demography of the Jews. Secondly, the defense for the Jews. And thirdly, the demolition by the Jews. Now, I ought to explain, of course, that first heading. Demography is the study of human populations. So anything that happens to a population is a subject of demographic interest. Let me take a very simple example. Suppose a postgraduate student at Hatfield University was given the subject of examining the demography of Welwyn Garden City. And she was doing this for her PhD project. And of course, the first thing she needed to know was the population. What is the population of Welwyn Garden City? But that wouldn't get her PhD. She had to then delve into that fact much more deeply. And so the next task was to find out how many of the population of Welwyn Garden City were under 18, were legally children. And that was not quite so simple, because that's a number that could be changing almost week by week. And then she might need to find out how many of the population belong to a certain ethnic group, and so on. You can go on asking questions, can't you, about the population of Welwyn Garden City? Well, the demography that was taking place in the time of Esther, and particularly at this critical time, was very important, and it was changing daily. You see, when Haman was alive, the Jews were a substantial but self-isolated part, tribe, if you like, put it that way, in the empire. 44% is an estimate from many different sources of the percentage of Jews in the empire once it had expanded and taken over the empires of previous rulers. It had taken over the Syrian Empire, and then it had taken over the Babylonian Empire. And when these other empires were conquered and incorporated into the Persian Empire, then, of course, it grew to be an enormous empire, which stretched from Ethiopia in North Africa all the way over to the borders of India. 44% of the population were Jews. And the population was substantial, but they were in a minority, an easily recognized minority, because they had chosen to meet and carry on their lifestyle in a particular way, which depended, of course, very much on their religion, on their belief in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that set them apart from the rest of the population, which were, normally speaking, people who had many gods, polytheistic. And so at that time, when Haman was still alive, they were a very isolated and therefore very vulnerable group of people, tribe of people. But then things began to change. After Mordecai's edict had been circulated throughout the empire, we are told in verse 17 of chapter 8 that many declared themselves Jews for fear of the Jews. So suddenly, because they had this great fear that Mordecai would win any conflict that there might take place, and we can only ascribe that to the fact that the Jews had a particular God who intervened in the affairs of human activity. They had a fear of Mordecai, which implied a fear of God. And because of that, a lot of people, we're not told how many, it says just many declared themselves Jews because they're afraid of the Jews. And that means that many people who were not actually Jews at all, let it be known that they were Jews. They claimed to be Jews, and therefore they claimed to be on the side of Mordecai, and they believed that that side was going to win any conflict that happened. But then there was another addition. On the very day when Haman's edict was about to be, or was supposed to be, implemented, on that very day, we're told that all the officials, it is chapter 9 and verse 3, all the officials of the provinces, satraps, governors, and royal agents helped the Jews. They changed sides, if you like. They may have been neutral before, but now they went along on that very day, very early in the morning, I'm quite sure, and said, look, we're on your side. And they brought gifts to prove that point. But they joined the forces, if you like, of Mordecai. And so the Jews now, if we count these newcomers had not only their own original proportion of the population of the empire, but they also had these people who joined because they were afraid that Mordecai would win, and that happened before the edict day. I'm going to use that word, that magic day, that particular day when both of the edicts were going to be put into force. Before that happened, you had these people who joined in order to be on the Jews' side when troubles started. And then on that very day, you had all these official people, leaders of the various provinces and the king's agents and so on, who were, of course, followed by large numbers of people. A leader normally in his actions is followed by the people he rules over. And so an enormous change in what we might call the population statistics was taking place, and there must have been left only a very small minority of Haman supporters who refused to change sides, a very small minority. And that claim, if you like, my assertion, is proven, as we'll see in a moment. It was proven by actual numbers, the actual numbers of the enemy that were killed by the Jews. Very, very small fraction of people. Well, now, that is the demography of the Jews, and that's, I can leave aside now, although we should come back to the importance of that in a moment. My second point was the defense of the Jews. What, I wonder, did Mordecai write in his edict to defend the Jews from Haman's edict? I'm going to use the word edict. I could use the word law, but I use the word edict to focus our attention on just these two laws, two edicts, Haman's edict and the edict of Mordecai. What do you think Mordecai would have written? He had a free hand. He could write what he liked. He put into his law anything he liked. And the natural thing for him to do was to distance himself from Haman, to have nothing to do with anything Haman had ordained and written in his edict, but to start with a fresh slate, as it were, to write something that would be capable of defusing the Haman edict. He'd ignore anything, distance himself from anything that Haman had written. But he didn't do that, did he? And I believe this is a case of God leading his servant Mordecai, saying, no, don't follow your instincts of distancing yourself from Haman. I want you to copy Haman. And that's where we come to this sheet that I distributed, because I think we're able to prove my point, the point I'm going to make, much more easily from this. So have that in your hand. What I've done here is to compare in the left-hand column Haman's edict with Mordecai's edict. And I'm conscious of the fact, of course, that people listening to this sermon on the podcast won't be able to see this. So I'm going to have to put in a few words of explanation. But we who are looking at it in person can immediately see that the edict of Mordecai was almost exactly the same as the edict of Haman. Everything you see printed in red is the same in both of the edicts. Now, clearly, if you look at the left-hand column, you'll find that in Esther 3 and verse 13, he's obviously changed the word Jews. Haman had given instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 30th day of the 12th month. So that had to change, obviously. And so Mordecai changed that to the following. The king, this is Esther 8 and verse 11, and Mordecai replaced the Jews as the victims of the action with the following. 8:11, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. So you see, he has replaced the victims. The victims now are no longer the Jews, as in Haman's edict, but the victims are these people who are described here as any people who would provide force of arms to attack the Jews. Now, that's really very important, because what it means is that the Jews would not attack anyone who had not first attacked them. And this is a defensive statement, hence the heading of the section. This is a defensive statement, and that is something that shows that the Jews' attitude, the Jews' moral attitude, was very, very different from Haman's. The Jews were committed here to defend themselves, just to defend themselves. It was a defensive thing. And so they would not attack anyone who had not first attacked them. That's the essence of the point. And that meant, of course, that even somebody who was inclined to attack them, someone who wanted to attack them, but didn't do so because, again, of the fear of God that was upon them, they'd refrained from attacking the Jews. They themselves would not be attacked, even though they were still enemies mentally, unless they actually took up arms against the Jews, then they would not be troubled. Now, I think this assertion is proven by some figures. Let me give them to you. The total population of the empire was something like 50 million, 50 million. And that was as a result of absorbing the previous empires of the Medes, the Syrians, and the Babylonians, and giving 127 provinces. Proportion who were Jews estimated to be 44%, as I mentioned before. That was a consensus figure from many different sources. If Haman's edict had prevailed, some 23 million Jews could have perished. With Mordecai's edict, 75,000 of the enemies were killed throughout the empire. That's told to us in chapter 9 and verse 16. And that means a tiny minority of the population, less than 2 in 1,000. And there were many residual Haman supporters who were afraid to attack for fear of God. So those who were actually killed by the Jews were 2 in 1,000. Whereas Haman's edict would have killed nearly half the population, getting on for half the population of the empire. Well, that's an enormous difference, and I think it emphasizes the fact that the Jews were acting defensively and were not out to kill people who mentally were still their enemies. They didn't want to do that. They only wanted to be defended against any who actually on that fateful day, the edict day, took up arms to kill them. And so I think we can say, moving on to my third point, the demolition by the Jews, we can clearly say that they made every attempt to minimize the slaughter of their enemies. They made the earliest possible notification of the new edict. They made sure that the whole empire saw that new edict, Mordecai's edict, before the edict day, which gave them choice to do that. And then what did he write in his edict? He wrote defensively, and he copied the edict of Haman. Now, why did he do this? Well, I think the answer is simply this. I think the Lord showed him that he, Mordecai, simply did not have time to ensure that his edict passed measure as a legal document. You see, these edicts were legal documents. And as you well know, even today, legal documents have to be very carefully written, because it's so easy for a legal document to contain a loophole or an error. And in order to ensure that there was no such fault or defect in the edict he composed, Haman took 3 months from the time he was given permission to kill the Jews to the time that the edict was published. What was happening during that 3 months? Well, they were working on the wording of the document. They were making absolutely sure that the wording had no defect, had no loophole, no escape route in it. They wanted to be sure that it would absolutely be fulfilled to the letter. Now, when Mordecai wrote his edict, he had no time to do that. Anyway, he wasn't a lawyer. Haman was obviously a lawyer, a person with great knowledge and understanding of the law. Mordecai didn't have that knowledge. How could he ensure that his edict did not have any loopholes, any faults that might invalidate it? I mean, we read every day, I think, or every week at least, in our newspapers, of legal documents that have been composed by an amateur, maybe a will, and there's ambiguity in the will, and there may be errors in the will, and it has to be set aside, can't be implemented because it is ambiguous or because it makes a mistake. Now, that's happening all the time in our own society, and I'm sure it was true here. It was very, very important to be sure that your new law was legally foolproof. And the best way to do that was for Mordecai to simply take Haman's law and make the minimum number of changes that were necessary to ensure that he didn't make a mess of the original. He stuck to the original and made only the necessary changes. And so it's obvious that they tried very hard to keep the legality of Haman's edict, but just changed it actually in a minimal way, minimal changes. Now, what did this mean? It meant that some of Haman's cruelest provisions remained in Mordecai's edict, such as total annihilation of these enemies, infants and women also to be killed, and possessions plundered. And the question arises, of course, that surely this makes Mordecai just as guilty on the moral level as Haman. in spite of the fact that he minimized the number of the enemy that were going to be killed in various ways that we've looked at, it means that on a moral level, his edict talked about annihilating the enemy's infants and women also to be killed and the possessions to be plundered. Now, my reply to that, and this is the opinion of most commentators, in fact, is that the provisions made by Haman and retained by Mordecai in the interest of minimizing the changes could be and were abandoned when Mordecai's edict was implemented. Now, this is explicitly stated, isn't it? First of all, in chapter 8 and verses 9, 15, and 16, we find the repeated statement that, quote, the Jews lay no hands on the plunder. But just a minute. Mordecai's edict said that they should do so. They should take the plunder. But they didn't do it. So they abandoned one of the unsavory provisions in Haman's edict, which had been taken over simply to avoid making too many changes and therefore being in danger of rendering the new edict unsuitable and error-prone. So this is one thing that was borrowed from Haman's edict that they abandoned. And then secondly, it is also clear that the Jews killed only men. Chapter 9, verses 6, 12, and 15. It doesn't say that the Jews killed so many persons, or the Jews killed 500 without mentioning any kind of noun. Now, I think it's very clear that they could not have retained the killing of children and women. You see, you would never call an infant a man. They killed 500 men, not persons. Could have just said they killed 500. But they would never have killed children because a child would never be called a man. Baby or a toddler, you'd never call that child a man, except as a joke. And so it's quite clear that they were not killing children. And I think by extension, implication, they were not killing women. They only killed men, only killed those who would be capable of launching a counterattack immediately and creating a serious conflict. And that is to say the opinion of most commentators, that only males above some age, such as 18, were killed, since they alone constituted an immediate danger of a counterattack. So the Jews retained the high moral ground, even though they well knew that male children quickly grew up to be men. If they were children, they weren't killed, even though in a few years' time they would have a lot of angry young men wanting to somehow undermine the new regime in which the king supported the Jews and furthered their interests, as we shall see in probably the final talk of this subject next time I speak. So if we take a step back from everything, what do we see? Well, we see that the Jews retained the high moral ground. We see that the Lord guided Mordecai's thinking in writing his edict. We see that God's purpose was overall the preservation of the Jewish race. And as I pointed out right at the beginning of this series, unless that Jewish race had been preserved, there would never have been a Jewish couple living in Jerusalem and having a baby called Jesus. The whole Christology of the Bible would have been destroyed. The Bible itself would have been proven unreliable because the promises made to Abraham and the earlier patriarchs would not have been fulfilled if Haman's scheme had come about. And so God was behind the scenes, if you like, manipulating all the events that we reviewed over the last several months, all the events, all the thinking of his people, even the thinking of his enemies. They're all manipulated so that the outcome was the preservation of the Jewish race. God is sovereign. God is in control, as we were looking at in the earlier part of this service in the Catechism. So we can take great courage from that, can't we? That God is in control of all things, of your personal lives, of the lives of nations, international problems. We do not need to fear because God is in control. We may not be in control of many things, but the one we call our Heavenly Father is.